Yeah, welcome everyone. Today we have Manuel and Lenore Blums to talk about insight from conscious Turing machine. Manuel Blum is a professor of CS Emeritus at UC Berkeley, 30 years, and the CMU, 20 years, and the visiting chair professor of computer science at Peking University for 2 years. His recent work on conscious Turing machine certifies his long-standing desire to learn how to think, which he tried and continues trying to do, but by understanding brains, machines, mathematics, cognition, and consciousness. He is proudest of his talented family and many exceptional students who got PhD under his wing. Lenore Blum is an American computer scientist and mathematician, founder and professor emeritus of mathematics and computer science department at Mills College, 20 years, distinguished career professor of computer science at Carnegie Mellon University, 20 years, and the visiting chair professor of computer science at Peking University for 2 years. He is known for stunning mathematical discoveries in the model theory of differential field, contributions to abstract models of computation, a book with Cooker, Sharp, and Smeyer entitled Complexity and Real Computation, Springer, 1998, and the current work on the model of consciousness called Conscious Turing Machine, CTM, among many other contributions. In 2005, she received President Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, Engineering Mentoring, given her by President George W. Bush. In 2018, she received the Simmons University Distinguished Alumni Lifetime Achievement Award. There are a lot we can say about Manuel and Lenore, but because the time is short, so we cut here and listen to them. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you, Deng Xiaoti, for inviting Manuel Blum and me to speak at IJTCS 2021. We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the wonderful students and TAs in the short course we taught at Peking U, where we discussed consciousness from a theoretical computer science perspective and introduced the conscious Turing machine. You will have a chance to hear from 3 student teams from our class in the Undergraduate Research Forum in this conference. I will start this presentation with an overview of the model and give 3 high-level explanatory examples. Then Manuel will discuss more insights and the feeling of consciousness. Well, what can theoretical computer science contribute to the discussion of consciousness? Well, we also want to understand consciousness. We want to give a simple mathematical model to help us get this understanding. We want to give a good definition of chunk. We want to distinguish between simulating and experiencing. We want properties of consciousness to be emergent, not programmed in. We are not looking for a model of the brain, nor of learning or cognition. We are looking for a model of consciousness. We are looking for simplicity, not complexity. We want to provide a blueprint for building a conscious-like machine. And this is currently under construction by Jean-Louis Villacrosse. Well, what do we mean by consciousness? Roughly speaking, consciousness or conscious awareness is everything you pay attention to, awake or dreaming, but not dreamless sleep. It's what you see, what you hear, what you feel, what you smell, what you taste, your joys, fears, sorrows, pains, and most especially your own inner private speech, what gives you the sense of self. In our view, consciousness is a property of all properly organized computing systems, whether made of flesh and blood or metal and silicon. And our thesis is it is the architecture and in particular the global workspace architecture, key processors that are able to communicate thoughts, plans, images, sensations, and expressive inner language, in particular the inner speech processor and the model of the world processor that communicate in an expressive multimodal inner language, which we call brainish, and a secular dynamics of prediction, feedback, and learning that make them conscious. Plus some motivation, desire and energy, and a minimal cognitive ability. Our model will explain the brain at a very high level of abstraction, at levels well above that of neurons and neuronal activity. So we give a formal definition of a machine for consciousness, the CTM, and then we define consciousness in that model, and then point out properties of consciousness in that model. We are inspired by Turing's simple yet powerful model of a computer that helps give understanding of computation. And our architecture formalizes the theater model or the global workspace model of cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Bars. Bars describes conscious awareness through a theater analogy. Consciousness is the activity of actors in a play performing on the stage of working or short-term memory, and the inner speech actor is often on stage. And their performance is under observation by a huge audience of unconscious processors in long-term memory that are sitting in the dark. This may have happened to you once or twice. It certainly happened to me. You're at a party, you see somebody you know, but for the life of you, you can't remember her name. And then when you get home, about a half hour later, her name pops up. Oh, that's Tina. Well, what's going on? So what's her name gets into short-term memory, and then it gets broadcast down to all the unconscious processors sitting there in the dark. And one processor recalls where you first met. Oh, that was in a computer science class, and that gets broadcast down again to all the long-term memory processors. And another processor remembers something of what she does. Oh, she's studying complexity theory, and that gets broadcast down. Another processor remembers her name begins with T, that gets broadcast down. And a half hour later, her name comes up to the stage. That's the conscious short-term memory from the audience of unconscious long-term memory processors, which has been thinking, searching. And this conscious self on stage doesn't know how or where her name was found. The conscious self is not privy to the workings of the unconscious self. And there's a very famous example, mathematician Henri Poincaré, and he tells this story of working day and night on a hard math problem, and he can't crack it. And luckily, he says, a friend invites him on a trip. And then he says, as soon as he puts his foot on the bus, the idea came to him. So without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it, that the transformations I had used to define the Fuchsian functions were identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. In other words, he had really amassed a lot of information that had gone down to his unconscious processors, the audience. They were talking to each other furiously. And then when he was really more relaxed, some of those processors popped up into short-term memory, and he showed this result. So here is Barr's model of consciousness. We have in the center working storage, which is the stage. And down below here, we have many long-term memory processors. That's the audience. And on the left, we have input coming in through sensors to the working stage. And on the right, we have output going to actuators to the real world from the storage, working storage. And here on top, we have a central executive. This might be the theater manager, the drama director, so forth. And now let's give our formal definition of a conscious Turing machine. And it's formally defined as a seven-tuple, as the Turing machine is defined as a seven-tuple of SCM, LTM, input, output, uptree, downtree, and links. And I will tell you what each of these are. So we start with STM, that's our short-term memory. It's a read-write memory, and that's our stage. And our stage can hold one chunk of information. Now, this is not the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks that the psychologist George Miller talked about in the 50s, which is the amount of information he said we could keep in any moment in time in our short-term memory, the magic number. But we can get away with one chunk, and since we're looking for simplicity, one chunk will do. Now we have many, many long-term memory processors. These are our unconscious processors. They are parallel, they're powerful. There's an enormous collection, maybe 10 to the 7th, we imagine. And they start off not too connected, but as the CTM matures, they will become more and more connected, as we shall see. This is our audience. We also have input maps from the external world. These maps go from the external world through sensors like eyes and ears to some special processors, and language, the worldish language, is translated into the internal language brainish. That's the inner language used by the processors in the conscious Turing machine to communicate with each other. It's a multimodal language used to express inner speech, inner vision, and inner sensations, expressed in words and phrases called gists. The language is richer and more expressive than outer languages. And having an expressive inner language is an important component of the feeling of consciousness. Now, we also have output maps that go from long-term memory processors to actuators that affect the outside world. And again, we have a translation from brainish into worldish. And you might have noticed that the input maps and the output maps go to and from the long-term memory processors. They don't go through short-term memory. Boris has them going through short-term memory. We view short-term memory as mainly just a holder of information that's going to be the conscious content of the CTM. Now we have the uptree, which is the conduit for the competition for long-term memory processors to get their information on stage. So what is this information? Well, we say the information is conducted in forms of chunks. And a chunk for us formally is a six-tuple. It consists its address, the address of the processor putting in the chunk. And if there are 10 to the 7th processors, this will be like a 7-digit number. Then we have the time that the chunk was put into the competition. A gist, that is the small amount of information. It could be a query, an answer to a query. It could be a thought, and it could be an announcement that the processor wants to get into short-term memory. And then we have the weight. And the weight is sort of the value that the processor gives its gist. And it can be a positive value or a negative value. And then we have the intensity, which starts off as the absolute value of the weight, and the mood, which starts as the weight. So as the chunk moves up the competition tree, the up tree, the address, the time, the gist, and the weight will stay the same, but the intensity and the mood will change. And here I'm giving you an example of a possible competition going up. And we have the pain, joy, and fear processor has put in some chunks. Other processors have, but we're only looking at these. And I'm only showing you two components of the chunk. I'm showing you sort of an indication of the gist and also the mood that at that stage for that chunk. And so let's look over here where we have pain competing with joy, and pain has -5 mood and joy has a +3 mood. And in this particular competition, we're going to take the one that has the largest absolute value of mood, and that was going to be the winner. So pain wins the competition here, and the mood will change, and that will be the sum of the two moods down below. So -5 + 3 is -2. And that sort of makes perfect sense. If you have some pain and then you have some joy, then that joy might mitigate the pain a little, so the pain will go down. And now at the next level, we have pain competing with fear. Fear is going to win out. It has a larger absolute value of mood. And now the mood sum. And that again makes a little bit of sense. If you have fear and then you have pain, then the fear might be exacerbated. So that's how the mood is changing as we're going up. We note that the competition algorithm is computed locally and quickly, and this is an important feature of our model. The competition algorithm consists of a competition function, f, which chooses the local winner. And in the case we've been looking at, f is the absolute value of the mood. And the winning chunk also incorporates global information. So actually at each stage, the winning chunk will have its intensity, the sum of the intensities of the two competing chunks, and its mood, the sum of the moods of the competing chunks. And as this goes up, this will include more and more global information. We found that a probabilistic model actually has a lot of features that we want, and so we can incorporate into every node in the uptree a coin flip neuron. And these A's and B's are really, in this particular case, they're the absolute values of the moods. And so pain goes up with a probability of 5 A's, and joy goes up with a probability of 3 A's. Here we have a theorem for the probabilistic CTM. Let F be any additive competition function, then for all processors P and time T, the probability that P wins the competition that began at time T will be F of the chunk that P put in at time T over the sum of the F values of each of the chunks that were put in to competition at time T. And this has a nice corollary that chunks get into the short-term memory in proportion to their importance with respect to F value and probability, and hence independent of the submitting processor location. And let me give you an example where this plays out. We're going to take F to be intensity because that's an additive competition function. And I have deterministic competition function on the left, a probabilistic competition function on the right. They have the same 4 processors, each putting in similar GIST, A, B, C, D, with intensities 3, 3, 1, 4, 3, 3, 1, 4. And if you look at the deterministic competition tree, D has the highest intensity value, 4, but A gets into the top here because of the way we've arranged the processors at the bottom. On the other hand, in the probabilistic competition tree, D gets into the top here, or that's the short-term memory, with a probability of 4 11ths, whereas A will get into the top here with probability 3 11ths, and even C will have some chance of getting into the top with a probability of 1 11th. In other words, even GIST with very low intensity will have some chance of getting into short-term memory, which is something we would like. So as soon as a chunk gets into short-term memory, it's immediately broadcast down through the down tree, and it goes to all long-term memory processors. And so everybody's concentrating on or what got into short-term memory. You might think when processors put chunks into the competition, that might be something like a prediction that they're giving. And now with the feedback they're getting is from the broadcast. They're getting some feedback here. And so that gives them a chance to do some learning the next time around, whether they should change the value of the weights that they give and so forth. And in fact, we might have some processors that are too bold and they're giving too much weight to their ideas, and they get into short-term memory, but later on they realize they're wrong. Or we could have a situation where some processors are very timid and yet they're quite intelligent and they're giving good information, but it just doesn't get into short-term memory, and they've got to see that and sort of boost their weights. And so what we employ here in each of the long-term processors is Alvin Blum's sleeping experts algorithm, which tends to balance things out. Okay, so now let me go through the whole dynamics. We have input map, something coming in from the outside world, which is going to, let's say, the inner vision, and the fear processor reacts to that. And perhaps the fear processor's chunk wins the competition and gets into short-term memory. That's immediately broadcast to all long-term memory processors, and some processors then react. In particular, the inner speech processor somehow reacts to the fear. And so notice is what happens is that the long-term memory processor A will link up to processor B when B answers A's call. So inner speech answered fear's call, so to speak, and we'll have a kind of linking form at this stage. So this is like the Hebbian rule, where neurons that fire together wire together. But more importantly for us, is that linking enables conscious processing to become unconscious. So after a while, as CTM grows and matures, there'll be more and more links formed, and there'll be more and more activity going on amongst the long-term memory processors, as in Poincaré's long-term memory processors were really working furiously. So now we've actually, with links, have given the description of each of the members of the 7 tuple. And we've talked about chunk. And we talk about our predictive dynamics, which you think is really critical to consciousness, where you have prediction, and the prediction can come in through chunks, feedback coming in from the outside world, from the down tree, and from links, and then the learning process. We can now talk about what do we mean by consciousness in the CTM. So we will say that the chunk that gets into the short-term memory is the conscious content of the conscious Turing machine. And we'll say consciousness in the CTM, in the conscious Turing machine, is the awareness, or in other words, the reception by all long-term memory processors of the conscious content of CTM. And the constant activity of chunks competing to get into STM and its broadcast creates kind of what we might call a stream of consciousness. The reasonableness of our definition of consciousness, so after all, just a definition, lies in the number of concepts that the model explains easily and naturally. And I'd like to give you three, and they have a little bit to do with vision. And the first is called blind sight. And here we have this man sitting on a sofa in a very complicated, messy room. It looks like an obstacle course. And he's asked to go to the other room. Perhaps they're having a meal in there. And he says, well, but I can't see. Nevertheless, he gets up, walks to the other room, goes through the door, avoiding all the obstacles. What's going on? So at a very high level, here's an explanation. So what's happening, input is coming from the external world, and it is actually going to the vision processor. The vision processor works properly, and it sends messages to the walk actuator. But what's happening is the uptree connection from visions to the STM is broken, or it doesn't exist. And that's what's happening, so that this person, the blindsided person, doesn't have any conscious sense that it can see. There's nothing going up to STM to get broadcast. And there's some reason to believe that some of this is happening in the brain. So without vision processor having access to STM, he has no conscious sense that he can see. And now let's look at a second example of unintentional blindness. Now here's a film that's pretty well known. You've probably seen it before. And viewers of this film were asked to count how many times white-shirted players passed the ball. So they were actually pretty good about this. And most people say 15, which I think was the right number. But did they see the gorilla? Did you see the gorilla? And here's the gorilla in plain sight. So what's going on? Why didn't we see the gorilla? So when we're given a task to look for, like white-shirted players passing the ball, we're giving higher weights to those chunks that we're putting into a competition. So are given to the task, and we might not be conscious of the things in the picture that now have lower weights. So anything in black, we're not paying attention to. So it's the weights that are given to the gist and the chunk that are really causing this kind of unintentional blindness. And the third example is called change blindness. And here's another film which demonstrates this. And here we have a detective coming into a room, and he says, clearly somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe. Each of you tell me your whereabouts. And then the maid says, I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom. And the butler says, I was buttering the lordship's scones. And Lady Smythe says, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed. And of course, the detective immediately says, Constable, arrest Lady Smythe. But how did you know, she says. And he says, well, madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May. But there's another mystery here for us. And here's the initial shot of the film, and here's the last shot of the film. And did you notice all the changes? For example, the detective's coat is completely different, and the flowers have changed. And in fact, the dead guy has changed his clothes, and his foot's up in the air, his knees bent, and so forth. And there's a zillion other changes that we didn't notice. So what's going on? Why didn't we see the many changes? Well, again, a high-level explanation is that we have the same gist that's describing the first scene and the last scene. The same gist is like the scene is the living room of a mansion with butler, maid, and detective, and a maid laid out on the floor. And also the filmmaker is very clever. He doesn't show you the transition. We went from the first scene to the maid and then went to Lady Smythe and the butler. And they were like cuts, so you did not see the transition. And in fact, when you see the end thing, you've sort of forgotten how the beginning went, except for the gist. So again, here are the high-level explanations for blind sight. They're broken branches going from the long-term memory processor up to short-term memory, high-level explanation. In intentional blindness, it's the weight that we give for what we're looking at, and lower weights, high weights for what we're looking at, low weights for things that are not important for us to see. And in a change blindness, it's the gist that we've given. Well, we haven't noticed the change because the gist for the picture, the first picture and the last picture, are really the same. So thank you. And now part 2, Manuel will discuss more insights and the feeling of consciousness. Manuel?
Thanks, Lenore. Why is consciousness of a chunk defined as reception of its broadcast? The broadcast of a chunk is not in itself what makes the CTM magically feel consciousness of that chunk. The reception of that broadcast is what begins to provide that feeling of consciousness, but even that is not all that makes the CTM feel conscious of the chunk. What else is there? A goodly part of what makes the CTM feel conscious of a chunk is the communication that occurs among processors following the chunk's reception. We believe that the CTM feels conscious awareness of a broadcasted chunk on account of the unconscious brainish communication that occurs between linked processors following the reception of that chunk. Why and to what extent? Let's suppose that a really important chunk, one whose weight greatly exceeds those that preceded it, wins the competition for STM. It gets broadcast. When processors receive that important chunk, they set to work on it, each in their own way, to determine if they have something useful to say about it. They send relevant information to all processors linked to them and receive relevant information from those same linked processors. We suggest that attention to the chunk by the processors, wherein most processors pay attention to the broadcasted chunk and become aware of what other processors think about it, is what largely gives the CTM the feeling of consciousness. Feelings of consciousness arise in part from unconscious communication between processors. The above explanation is for mature CTM whose processors are highly linked. The newborn CTM has only a few links, if any. Links are created as the CTM matures. The infant CTM, having few links, is conscious in a different way from the mature CTM. In the infant CTM, processors deal with whatever information they receive, each in their own way, each oblivious, except for what is broadcast, to what other processors are doing. The processors in the infant CTM are more independent than in the mature CTM. The infant CTM is processors being less linked and therefore more independent can deal with many different thoughts, any one thought being handled by processors having less information on account of that independence. In sum, the infant CTM is conscious of many thoughts. The mature CTM is more concentrated on a single thought. How processors group? Well, in an infant, you have these several groups. In the juvenile, larger groups of processors, and in the mature CTM, many processors are linked. There's confirmation from child psychologist Alison Gopnik. What is it like to be a baby? In Scientific American, 2009. She says, quote, conventional wisdom has been that babies must be somehow less conscious than adults, if in fact they are conscious at all. Even development psychologists, including me, have tended to say that the amazing thing that we see in babies is, quote, just unconscious, unquote. As adults, when we attend to something in the world, we are vividly conscious of that particular thing and we shut out the surrounding world. The classic metaphor is that attention is like a spotlight, illuminating one part of the world and leaving the rest in darkness. The new thinking suggests that baby's consciousness is more like a lantern than a spotlight. It illuminates the entire world around them. Can science explain the feelings of qualia? Science explains the non-living and living worlds extremely well, but can science explain qualia, such as the taste of wine, the redness of an evening sky, the pain of a headache, or the ecstasy of first love? Many folks suggest that the understanding the feeling of qualia will require a new kind of science. They believe that today's science cannot explain the feelings of qualia. We believe otherwise. We expect that science, as we know it, can explain the feelings of qualia. No new forces required, no magic or spirit either. We believe that science can explain how to generate feelings like those of pleasure and pain, whether in flesh and blood, animals, or in robots made of silicon and gold. What counts as an explanation? We are looking for something different than neural circuit diagrams and/or neural correlates of consciousness. Desirable as it would be to have that knowledge, as that would be akin to explaining how a computer has feelings in some future world perhaps, by describing its electrical circuitry and the subcircuits that correlate with certain feelings. We are looking for something different than biochemicals and their effects, like dopamine for pleasure, serotonin for mood, and glutamate excitatory, as that would be like explaining feelings in a machine by describing signaling codes and their significance. We look for arguments that can explain qualia in both machines and animals. We argue that in some future world, machines can have feelings. We would especially like to understand what might generate feelings of pain and pleasure. The agony of pain and the ecstasy of joy beg for an explanation, if only because they are such a puzzle. The puzzle is that a mechanism, the body, is able to generate these feelings. How does it do that? To understand the problem, consider pain asymbolia. After a bump on the head, a person can become pain asymbolic, meaning they don't suffer from the feeling of pain. They know what pain is from the time before they got the bump, but nevertheless, they don't suffer from the feeling of pain. They can be burned, frozen, smashed, cut. All these things will cause pain, but not suffering. Pain asymbolics claim to still have the pain. They clearly know where and what kind it is, how hot or cold, but say it's okay. So what's missing in the pain asymbolic's head? But first, how might a robot with a CTM brain feel conscious? Certain processors, such as inner speech and model of the world, are especially important for generating feelings of consciousness. First, inner speech describes the contents of short-term memory and brainish. These are the inner thoughts and what the senses observe when awake or dreaming, the senses being outer senses, such as the ears and eyes on the world, and inner senses, such as the mind's ears and eyes. All thoughts and sensations are in brainish, the language of the brain. The brainish words are chunks whose gists are multimodal images, sounds, tactile sensations, tastes, odors, and so on. These brainish words are evident in the stuff of dreams. Certain processors, such as inner speech and model of the world, are especially important for generating feelings of consciousness. We just spoke about inner speech. The second one is the model of the world processor that maintains a model of both environment and entity. The entity is the robot that the CTM controls. The model of the world processor changes or replaces its models of the world as the entity moves around the world. Each model tends to have the entity itself, including the arms, legs, etc., that it uses for locomotion in the world and for manipulating the objects of the world. The model of the world distinguishes self from not self. When there is pain, it tracks the type and location of each pain. Before asking how a robot with a CTM brain might feel pain, let's ask, why should a robot feel pain anyway? Look at it this way. Today's robots are pain asymbolic. We want to know what is missing in a robot's brain that could make it feel pain as humans feel it. But first, why should robots suffer? There are at least 3 reasons. 1, for the same reason animals must suffer. Animals born without the suffering of pain don't live long. Such children typically live no more than 3 years. 2, because we want robots to have empathy. Humans find it hard to understand a feeling if they have never had that feeling. 3, to get insight into pain in humans and animals. How might a robot with a CTM brain feel pain? We have 3 suggestions for extreme pain, only 3. 1, broadcasts. Extreme pain is an actor that takes over all short-term memory. It prevents all other actors from reaching the stage. Pain messages and only pain messages are broadcast. Every processor knows of the pain. With few exceptions, nothing else can get to STM. This confirmation, under conditions that normally cause agony, pain asymbolics can think while normals cannot. In a Darwinian design, you might expect pain to lead to constructive thinking, but agony actually interferes with constructive thinking. It forces you to rely on your unconscious self. However, while broadcasts account for some pain, they do not account for the sudden excruciating pain at the moment you tear a ligament. What does? Interrupts. Sudden extreme pain, a finger touching a burning stove, interrupts all unconscious processors. Interrupts, as opposed to broadcasts, cause processors to instantly put their work on a stack, forces them to pay their maximum immediate attention to the interrupt. Interrupts differ from broadcasts, which send their information to processors without forcing them to put what they're doing on a stack. And 3, brainish, the multimodal language that processors use to communicate among themselves. Processors can scream pain. Their screams conjoin multimodal dialects. How are these ideas to be checked? For example, we would consider ourselves on the right track if these ideas could be used to give us a superpower, such as the ability to withstand great pain. Consider the pain of a root canal. In the CTM, when there is unbearable pain, nothing else can get into STM. But in me, I asked my dentist to not give me Novocaine when he was about to do a root canal. When his drill touched my nerve, I could still think to stop it. I could and did scream, "Stop!" So I failed. So I do not believe we have found the final answer. Nevertheless, we do believe that the CTM suggests simple explanations for a variety of phenomena. For example, Lenore tells herself, "You can do it." Stan Harris asks, who is saying you can do it and who is hearing it? The CTM helps one understand what is going on. Some processors say you can do it. That assertion reaches STM and is broadcast. All processors hear it. A check on CTM. Should positive and negative moods cancel? When a child skins her knee, it hurts. When the mother kisses the child, does that help? Yes. Does the knee still hurt? Yes. In the CTM, with F equal to absolute value of mood, negatives like skinning the knee and positives like mom's kiss can cancel completely. Neither reaches consciousness. Is that the way it is with humans? We don't think so. We think that the two cancel partially. We get to that next. We now go into overdrive. Define a competition function formally to be a map F from chunks to non-negative real numbers. The competition function f is used for exactly one purpose, to decide which of two siblings should rise to be parent. In the deterministic CTM, the sibling with the greater f value rises to be parent. In this particular case of the blue box, sibling 2 moves up because f of 2, which is 5, is greater than f of 1, which is 3. In the probabilistic CTM, which we consider to be the correct model, the decision which sibling moves up is made probabilistically. Sibling 1 moves up with probability proportional to its f value, that is, with probability equal to f of 1 divided by the sum f of 1 plus f of 2. Typical examples of competition functions are f of chunk equal to intensity. This f is additive, meaning f of x plus y equals f of x plus f of y. It is used for many examples and has many good properties. F of chunk equal to the absolute value of mood. This f is a non-additive competition function. That's because the absolute value of x plus y does not in general equal the absolute value of x plus the absolute value of y. It's used for many examples too, but is bad for several reasons, which we will go into. F of chunk equal to 1 plus address is a non-additive competition function. In the deterministic CTM only, this unusual f puts the chunk with highest address into STM. It does other things in the probabilistic CTM. We next explain why f equals the absolute value of mood is not a good competition function, and why f equals intensity plus x times the mood for any x between -1 and +1 is a good competition function. Now let's explain some competition functions. We've already mentioned that f equals the absolute value of mood has problems. An example of such a problem is that siblings with equal positive and negative moods cancel those moods completely. Neither sibling appears in STM. The CTM is unconscious of both siblings. Does that make sense? Consider, for example, suppose you're on the street and you're on the sidewalk and you see a 10-euro bill. Wow, that's great. That doesn't happen very often. You stoop to pick it up and you, unfortunately, you scrape your knee. Ouch, that hurts. Well, you're going to be conscious of both having found this 10-euro bill and of the fact that your knee is bleeding and hurts. Will you be unconscious of them? Of course not. So, no, that's not good. F equals intensity plus x mood, x times mood, is a lot better. If you look at the green box on the right, you see that A and B both move up to STM with equal probabilities, each with probability greater than a third. Wonderful thing about intensity plus x mood is that it's additive. So what gets to STM is completely explainable with probabilities at the leaves of the competition tree. Just compute those probabilities. Probability of A is that 8 divided by the sum, 8 plus 8 plus 2 plus 4. 8/22, that's the probability. And that probability holds no matter how you go about permuting those processors. Processors can be permuted without affecting what gets to STM. Next, we define optimism and pessimism, mania and depression. We say that CTM is level-headed if x equals 0, optimistic if x is greater than 0, manic if x is the extreme case of +1. We say that the CTM is pessimistic if x is less than 0, and completely depressed in the extreme case where x is -1. If x is 0, positive and negative chunks of the same weight have equal chance to reach STM. If x is greater than 0, the positive chunks have a better chance to get into STM than the negative chunks. And in the extreme case where x is +1, no negative chunk can get to STM. CTM is manic. Here we have an example where the weights are 2, 4, 6, and -8. The manic case occurs when x is +1. In that case, the -8 does not get to STM at all. Only the positive weights chunks can get there. In the depressed case, where x is -1, no positive weights can get up there. Only the negative weight, the -8, can get up there to STM. In fact, you can have lots of positive weights, high positive weights, and the negative weight can be -1, some very small negative, and all that the CTM will be conscious of is the negative weighted chunk. That's depression. Let's see some examples of how neuroscience and simple math have driven the definition of CTM. Barr's global theater model is great. I can't emphasize enough its importance to us. Before learning about it, we tried many models to try to understand consciousness. The finite state machine, for example, was Plato's model. In that machine, one begins at a start state and finds and in the process of growing up, you find your way to the state of the language that people around you are speaking. You start knowing all languages of the world at birth, even all languages that could exist in the world, but you find your way to the particular language that people around you speak. That's a fine model, but it gave us no insight into consciousness. We tried the Turing machine model, giving that Turing machine inputs from the world and actuator outputs to the world. But it too gave us no insight into consciousness. The CTM comes of making Barr's global theater model precise, with modifications based on what neuroscience has found and theoretical computer science has driven us to. Let's start with neuroscience. Barr's global theater model led us to CTM, but there are differences. First, Barr's has the audience members in his theater of consciousness gather in groups. Each group tries to send one of its members to the stage, but neurons can't move. So what's going on? In CTM, what gets to the stage is a script for the lone actor to read. Secondly, Barr's puts the conscious event somewhere between input and stage. It's not clear how consciousness arises in the model. And third, neuroscience shows that inputs do not connect directly to the stage, nor does the stage connect directly to outputs. In the CTM, inputs connect to the LTM processors, and these processors connect to the output. So neuroscience has influenced us to modify somewhat the Barr's global theater model. And so has some simple math. For example, the competition function, F equals absolute value of mood, is out. That was our first choice of function, and for many reasons it turned out to be bad. F equals intensity plus or minus X times the mood is in. In part, that's because F equals intensity plus or minus X times mood is provably the most general additive competition function, ensuring that its dynamics is independent of the permutation of processors. Second, the way mania and depression are explained as limiting values of X is lovely. Mania is at the far end of optimism, depression is at the far end of pessimism. And third, the use of probabilistic nodes in the competition tree is forced on us, as a deterministic CTM has serious problems. For example, if two chunks have the same weight, then whichever one gets into STM prevents the other from getting in. That's in the deterministic CTM. These problems are handled nicely in the probabilistic CTM by using truly random nodes. so the two chunks with the same weight, will spend equal amounts of time in STM. The probabilistic CTM can be made deterministic by using pseudo-randomness, but true randomness gives a simpler, cleaner solution. So this shows how neuroscience and simple mathematics have led us to define the CTM. And that's the end. Thank you.
Manuel and Blum. Manuel Blum and Lenore Blum. So yeah, we have quite some questions. I will go backward from the last one first. So one question is from Wei Chen. He asked so consciousness is modeled as asymmetry in the architecture as short memory versus long-term memory. And this is due to limited capacity of human brain. Can we interpret it as consciousness is a limitation rather than a feature? For machines, if there is no such capacity constraint, there is no need to design such an asymmetry architecture. So consciousness is not a necessity, right? Where machine AI without this conscious more powerful?
Okay, I'd like to make a comment on that. First of all, this asymmetry is not a way to think of it. The reason that short-term memory is so small is that the brain has to focus. And if you had too many things in that short-term memory, if there was a lot of things happening and you broadcast, processors wouldn't know what to work on. It would be like a chaotic system. So it's the focus of having, that's the reason to have the short-term memory. It's not a limited capacity, it's the focusing which is critical here. Sometimes people like to think of it as having a spotlight for consciousness. So I think that is a little bit misunderstanding of this reason for this structure. Second of all, we bring in computational complexity into our arguments for many, many things in terms of the size of the chunk that gets into short-term memory and the gist, again, for focusing purposes. And a lot of our explanations depend on limited resources. So explanations we might have for free will, for example, have to do with that the brain and this machine as well have limited resources. And so a lot of developments in computational complexity are taken into account here, both in the model and in our view of the brain. Manuel, do you want to add to that? You can't hear you.
Okay. I wrote a response to that question, okay, which was exactly what you said.
Okay.
I actually wrote it independently, so we agree there.
Good. Another question?
Yeah, next question is this. Is probabilistic CTM necessary? Deterministic CTM can still feel two feelings at the same time, so long as two corresponding LTM keeps sending chunks. It is okay so long as the value of mode intensity is slightly different. It may be hard for them to be the same. Chunks from different LTM takes charge of the STM alternatively. Then CTM can feel these two feelings simultaneously. The question is is a probabilistic CTM necessary?
So I think Manuel mentioned in his part of the talk that, you can get away with pseudo-randomness, and pseudo-randomness then can change probabilistic model to deterministic model. So you actually can get away. It's just, it's a simpler way to think of it if you have probability, but you can convert it using pseudorandomness. Again, Manuel, you want to add to that?
Well, the deterministic model, there are many reasons to think that the deterministic model is wrong. Just wrong. For example, if you have two thoughts, both of equal weight, one of them will get in, and then stays there. You have these two ideas. One of them, in the deterministic model, one of them will get into STM and you'll be conscious of it, and the other one will not.
I just would like to make a clarification. We have a deterministic model, and then we have a probabilistic model, and then we have a probabilistic model which we can turn into a deterministic model by using pseudorandomness. But this model, these two deterministic models are very different. One is a simulating probabilistic, and the other's not. So so we can have a deterministic model simulating a probabilistic model. That's very different than the deterministic model that we defined, which doesn't work. Okay?
Yeah. And the next question is, can CTM explain phenomenon that people can react before feeling pain under some situation, like putting fingers on the fire?
Yeah, again. It's again very interesting in terms of, so there have been a lot of experiments that show that people actually, before they act, they've actually unconsciously made a decision, right? And in fact, that happens in the CTM too, because if you think that there may be 10 to the 7th processors, and it maybe takes 10 nanoseconds to go up each stage, it turns out it takes about 200 or 300 nanoseconds, right, to go from long-term memory up from unconsciousness to consciousness, and then another 10 nanoseconds down, which again is very similar to what's happening in the brain. Decisions are made about 200, 250 nanoseconds before you're conscious of it. I'm not sure if that's exactly what this person is asking, but there is a similarity of this delay again happening in the CTM.
Let me come in. I believe the right answer is just that the input is going directly to the long-term memory processors, and from the long-term memory processors, the outputs are going directly to the outputs, and so you may appear to respond to an input, like the scream that Lenore talked about. Something terrible comes in and you scream, and you're only conscious of it later.
That's another. Well, I think those are two different phenomena that are happening, but that's very good. And that's exactly when this person was asking for the finger on the stove. You know, you're not even thinking of it. You just sort of comes in, and that's gone unconsciously.
Yeah.
Nice questions.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't know if there's time for more questions, but anyway.
Okay, let's just put one more question here. It's a simple one. So when studying CTM, how do we avoid introducing consciousness to LTM parts?
You have to think of the LTM processors as being algorithms. They are not. They don't have any feelings. They're nothing like that. They are simply algorithms.
Yeah.
Ordinary, standard algorithms.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Actually, there's still questions, but and also there is one response from Wei Chen. Thank Manuel and Lenore for their questions, because this question is. Wei Chen is in the Zoom, but we actually have a lot of people watching it from other broadcasting platform: AI Times, Bilibili, Call, Share, and 6 broadcasting platforms. So for them, the response is not so quick. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe we stop here and hope we